Welcome to this explainer. Today we are diving into a really massive structural mystery. Based on BuildAfrica.org's report, Why Africa Needs Better Projects, Not Just More Money. We constantly hear about the billions and billions of dollars supposedly needed for development, right? But the truth is actually far more fascinating. It turns out the continent's infrastructure gap isn't a money problem at all. Actually, it's a blueprint problem. So let's start with a really stunning paradox. Why do so many projects stall out when there is, in reality, significant global and regional capital actively looking for African infrastructure exposure right now? It's a question that completely flips the standard narrative upside down. From major development finance institutions to massive pension funds, the money is literally sitting there waiting. But the projects themselves remain completely starved. Samaila Zubero, the president and CEO of the Africa Finance Corporation, summed this up perfectly just ahead of the Africa We Build summit. He said, and I quote, "Africa is not capital poor, it is capital trapped." That one single statement completely shatters the myth of the missing money. It really forces us to stop and ask, okay, well, what's keeping all those vaults locked?
To answer that, let's get right into Section 1, the Great Infrastructure Paradox.
See, the real bottleneck here is that while demand and opportunities are absolutely abundant, there is a severe scarcity of projects that are actually structured to meet strict risk, governance, and enforcement thresholds. Think of it like a massive reservoir of global capital fighting to flow downstream, but the pipes, the projects themselves, just lack the structural resilience to handle the water pressure. When projects stall, we tend to blindly blame global market conditions, but honestly, more often than not, the foundation itself was just faulty from day one. Which brings us to Section 2, and probably my favorite part of this whole discussion, the myth of missing money. If you walked up to most investors and asked why they avoid African infrastructure, they'd almost certainly tell you, well, it's just too risky. But according to Moody's Analytics, Africa's cumulative 10-year infrastructure debt default rate is, get this, a mere 1.9%. Let that sink in for a second. 1.9%. That is actually the second lowest default rate in the entire world, sitting just behind the Middle East. It completely, totally destroys the common narrative. So we are looking at a massive disconnect here. On one side, you've got this perceived risk, right? People fearing high defaults, unmanageable country risk, extreme currency volatility. But then you look at the actual reality, a 1.9% default rate, highly predictable cash flows, and returns that are very often hedged against inflation. The big takeaway here is that long-term capital doesn't avoid Africa because of actual risk. No, it avoids risk that it can't mathematically model, price, or easily enforce in a courtroom. All right, so if risk isn't the real boogeyman, let's move to Section 3. What actually makes projects bankable? People throw around the word bankable all the time, usually treating it like a rubber stamp applied at the very end of a deal to say, we're good to go. But true bankability is actually the outcome of highly deliberate technical choices made much, much earlier in the process. It's the meticulous alignment of cash flows, risk allocation, governance, and enforcement. Basically, it can't just be assumed. It has to be deliberately built from the ground up. Well, how do you actually build it? First up, you've got to protect the cash flows early. We're talking about using escrow accounts and automatic payment waterfalls to absorb financial stress way before a third-party guarantee is ever triggered. Second, you have to put governance on autopilot. Step-in rights and enforcement triggers should operate by strict, pre-written rules, not through lengthy, highly emotional negotiations down the line. And third, resolve those unmanageable risks upstream so they don't crush the project later on. And that leads us perfectly into Section 4, the preparation phase showstopper. Here is a pretty devastating reality check regarding the execution phase. A staggering 90% of projects fail during development or simply stall out entirely. That means only about 10% actually reach financial close. Why? Because you can't put a Band-Aid on a broken leg. Weak, sloppy preparation simply cannot be corrected with a sweeter term sheet later on. No solid foundation, no funding. It's that simple. When you picture the sheer scale of the integrated infrastructure we're talking about here, I mean massive cross-border highway interchanges, huge regional energy grids, it becomes super obvious that project preparation requires immense upstream discipline. It has to be treated as a core investment function that requires high-risk seed capital, not just treated as some sort of casual side hustle. So how do we fix this? Let's look at Section 5, Building Trust with Structure. To get out of that preparation graveyard we just talked about,
Governments and institutions really need a brand new playbook. By intentionally combining concessional, softer financing with private capital, we can actively lower the overall investment risk while simultaneously boosting financial returns. It's all about bridging that gap securely with innovative structural instruments. This is exactly where blended finance comes in. That essentially means mixing that concessional seed money with private funds. Add in strategies like asset recycling to free up public revenues, and sponsors can significantly spread out their risk. Plus, tapping into local capital markets and private equity really helps crowd in private investors. All of this shifts the overwhelming burden off of fragile government balance sheets and places it onto a much more resilient financial ecosystem.
All right, final piece of the puzzle here, Section 6, Unleashing Trapped Domestic Capital.
Look, for Africa to truly control its own destiny, the solutions have to look inward just as much as they look outward. Projects are fundamentally more resilient when domestic institutional capital and blended currency structures are baked into the DNA from day one. This is an absolute game changer. Integrating local capital drastically reduces foreign exchange fragility, which, let's be honest, is the ultimate boogeyman for most international investors. Just look at real-world examples, like the Libido Corridor or the Kenya National Infrastructure Fund. They prove exactly what happens when we stop desperately chasing funding and instead start building integrated economic systems. We connect resources to energy, we link logistics directly to markets, and we align capital with policy for actual job creation. We're finally moving away from isolated, shiny vanity projects and stepping into genuine industrial transformation. So, I'm going to leave you with this somewhat provocative thought. Will policymakers and sponsors finally shift their focus from chasing funding to actually building solid structure? Because honestly, until deliberate upstream structural choices become the main priority, Africa's infrastructure is going to remain trapped. Ultimately, this isn't a challenge of dollars, it's a challenge of discipline. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it helps you view the mechanics of global development in a completely new light. Keep learning, and I will see you next time.